So coming to a conference organized by IDS, to me, is also a homecoming, because at least I spent 3 years doing development studies at the University of Dar es Salaam when I was a student. But it also gives me an opportunity to reflect a little bit on what I remember when we were studying development studies here, and my own thinking on how we should go about teaching development studies. I understand now there's a program, first degree in development studies. So the people will just come here and do development studies and get their degree and go. So my own experience in learning DS here, in certain ways, gives me a little bit of a license to comment on how we should move forward. Not because I'm a minister, because of the life I went through here. And I believe this is just thought-provoking kind of contribution to you. And I believe you'll reflect that. I saw the papers that you're going to discuss here. I didn't see any specific discussions about really rethinking the future of development studies per se. I saw a number of papers, but I just want to believe that you will also spend some time thinking on how to shape the cause of in development studies to ensure that really it increases the contribution, it prepares the graduate better in a way that he will be or should be useful in the society. When I was doing DS then, there was a sense that a huge chunk of the course was more of indoctrination than instilling critical thinking to students. And this is something I want you to reflect, whether we have departed significantly from that kind of experience. We had lecturers who were Marxist. When they come to class, what they will do is completely to dismiss any other approach, for instance, Marxian economics and mainstream economics. And they will not really try to give insight into what is entailed in mainstream economics and what you have in Marxian economics. It was almost like a religious class, a theology, indoctrination, that anything else is completely wrong, and therefore we have to focus and read the Das Kapital. And I believe hardly any students finished the Das Kapital, and you had those books by Progress Publishers that we are using to learn Marxian economics and so on. And the reason really I wanted to do it in the third year was to try to widen the thinking, rather than just straitjacket yourself, whether you're a Marxist economist or mainstream economist. Try to combine the two and see where they meet, because I look at the best economists of our time, Paul Samuelson, whose book we are using for undergraduate, it was a landmark book across the world. He also spent a lot of time studying Marxian economics, but he understood it, but he was teaching mainstream economics. And currently now, I think one of the icons of economics is Professor Amartya Sen, who has done a lot of philosophical thinking, including studying Marxism, but at the same time studying mainstream and other philosophical strands, and developed his way of evaluating people's progress, development. And his thinking is that development is not just about income. I remember Mwalimu Nyerere, in his collection of essays called Freedom and Development, one of the main messages that you cannot measure development in terms of GDP alone, or in terms of buildings or tarmac road. Development is more than that. Development includes people being free. Julius Nyerere, and I think that collection of essays was published in 1973. Amartya Sen wrote a book called Development as Freedom. Now, Freedom and Development, Julius Nyerere. Development as Freedom, Amartya Sen, 1999. And he won a Nobel Prize. And the arguments were similar, except Amartya Sen was a little bit more technical. That development is a process of overcoming various kinds of unfreedoms. Freedom against hunger, freedom against ignorance, freedom against tyranny. So freedom to conduct your life without being afraid that the police will knock at your door for no any other reason, just to prove that there is an authority out there. So that was the thinking of Nyerere, and articulation of this by Amartya Sen was made possible because he had a very wide way of looking at things. He's a mainstream economist at Cambridge and Harvard and so on, but he also invests heavily to read alternative critical thinking. So when I was looking at my experience at the university, the teaching then, a huge chunk I felt was more of indoctrination rather than instilling critical thinking. No wonder, the moment Soviet Union collapsed, ideas scrambled to get rid of Marxian economics and look for other things to teach. What does that mean? It was taught because there was the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and large chunk of the teaching was aligned to the Eastern Bloc. And the moment Eastern Bloc collapsed, the entire institution was scrambling to try to look for relevance and alternative think of teaching. If the teaching was critical even then, rather than indoctrination, I don't think there would have been a need to abandon the approach, because we'll have seen the teaching of development studies approaching all aspects, including, for instance, mainstream economics. What does it mean to have market economy? What are the limits of market economy? What are the strengths of market economy? What do they say when they say the price will determine allocation of resources more efficient than not? And why did Marx felt that capitalism will have to collapse at some time? And his own assessment of historical development of humankind, from what you call Ujima then, as we are taught, all the way to feudal society to capitalism. If the teaching was critical and broad-based and preparing students with tools to analyze all these kind of things, I don't think the collapse of Soviet Union will have entailed radical shift in a way that development studies was taught. So this is the first thing I want to relate to you, that even now at our universities, when we teach, all we need is to, especially universities, is to ensure that we equip students with critical thinking capabilities so that they can analyze things. And the moment they graduate, they'll continue to approach subjects with the same tools that they gain from the university and the same attitude that they gain from the university. And I think even now, development studies is very important. It was important then. And to me, it was immensely useful because I loved it. And as I said, I did extra 1 year. By that time, you didn't have to do extra course. So you had to ask for permission. And you'll do the course. They say, if you pass, you'll get A. If you fail, they'll put a failure, but you'll not even receipt for exam because the university has no resources to support you. So you do it at your own risk, but failure does not prevent you from graduating. So I enjoyed it immensely. And I think development studies remains quite relevant, but I think the approach needs to be critically evaluated. That's why rethinking the future of development studies, to me, seems to be a very important issue, to continuously question, interrogate the way we teach our students. We are doing that across our entire education system, but I think development studies also need to be interrogated as such. As of now, what I think is critical, and I haven't had a benefit of looking at the content of the teaching right now, I think we need to make sure that, at least for the development studies, that is compulsory to all students. And I believe still it's compulsory, right? Yes. The aspect that is compulsory to all students, I think it's very important to have very critical look at the economic history of Tanzania. Very critical exposure. Students should have an exposure on economic history of our country. And the reason for that is that we need to examine all aspects of the way our country evolved and developed and make sure that students can learn mistakes that we committed and strengthen areas where we were doing very well. And they say, if you don't learn history, you are bound to repeat mistakes that have been committed before. So our country went through a wide range of economic management. We started with more or less market economy from 1961 to 67. And then we approached the economy through command and control system, more or less, from 1967, and it went on. At some point, it was starting to loosen up a little bit, but really, it loosened up decisively 1995 when President Mkapa took over. It started with President Mwinyi in 1985, but there was push and pull. It was not clear whether it's hot or cold, but 1995 we started to push decisively towards more market-oriented economy. And we went through that, and I don't want to comment too much about very recent history, but you can reflect yourself whether the gain we had during the command and control were sustainable, and whether the gain we get through more market economy is sustainable, whether the society we're building is relevant. But there are so many lessons, and I picked a book written by that was supposed to be launched on 17th. I think it's going to be launched, On My Father's Wings, an entrepreneurial journey of finding humility, resilience, and lasting legacy. Michael Shirima, the person who launched Precision Air. He just wrote his memoirs. Look, if you read that and you try to relate the experience, the way he grew up, his bold decisions to abandon doing engineering degree Nairobi University and went to try to be a pilot and then later do some aviation engineering of some kind. Came back, worked for the East African Airways, and then came to work for Air Tanzania. And the reason he resigned from his office at tender age, not knowing where to go, the frustrations he had with the bureaucracy, the fact that we had a system that will not respect meritocracy, and decisions by some of the big guns, like the plane is flying from Arusha to Dar, but because there are two VIPs, it has to go to Tabora and come to Dar. If you read through this book, you can try to understand some of the mistakes that we made. The Air Tanzania collapsed at some point. And there are more books that gives us insights. So I think development studies needs to help us to evaluate economic history. I might be a little bit biased towards economics because I'm an economist, but to be honest, it's about butter and bread, okay? At the end of the day, it's about life, and the first thing is what you eat, whether you can get enough on the table, and so on. So the way we organize our economic arrangements throughout history and the way we implemented it must inform us on how to move forward from there. So without saying which one is right, which one is wrong, I think I will propose that you critically look at that. And perhaps one of the things is to have more people writing about this and collecting information from people whose lifetime experience tell us a lot. I think if you read Edwin Mtei's book also, from the Godhead to the Governor, how he also resigned as a Minister of Finance. And it's a very nice story that because he was summoned to Msasani, to Mwalimu Nyerere, and Mwalimu was telling him about TPC, that this guy wants to sell TPC, the government has to buy it. He said, but we don't have anything in the coffer. Mwalimu said, you have, and he says, Malichela was there, he's the Minister of Agriculture. He said, but find the money, because we are building a socialist country, we have to buy TPC, and you have this person who is selling, it's the time to do that. And I was saying, but Mwalimu, all we need is because our parastotals are draining the treasury. We need to find experts to organize our parastotals and try to make them sustainable. Let's look for expatriates. Expatriates, a socialist economy will bring expatriates from where? From UK, okay? So there was a tension. So when he left Msasani, if you read the book, he was shaking. He was driving his car himself. And he was involved in a minor accident because he was very tense because he had decided that he would have to resign. So he drove himself to the office in the Treasury, opened the office. He didn't have a secretary. He wrote a letter by hand to request Mwalimu that I want to request that I step aside and that you pick somebody else to be your chief economic advisor in a very polite way to tender his resignation. And then he called Msasani to request to see Mwalimu. Mwalimu said, let him come. So he drove again back to Msasani. From Magogoni to Msasani. He went and he said, Mwalimu, by the time he was going, somebody had stopped him. He said, there's a letter for you. So he picked the letter, put on the passenger's chair. He didn't open it. So he drove all the way to Mwalimu. Knocked Mwalimu, received him, and Mwalimu was very surprised. He said, what is it, Edwin? He says, I was shaking. Sir, I wrote a letter to kindly ask that I resign as the Minister of Finance, so I pave way for somebody who is better than me, who can advise you on how to run and organize the economy, sir. Mwalimu said, I don't remember the name. So and so gave you a letter? Did you get it? Yes, sir, but I had it, read it. I said, okay, fine. He took the letter, read it, called Paul Sozigwa, I said, announce Radio Tanzania that ndugu Edwin Mtei amejiuzulu kama waziri wa fedha na nimemkubalia. So it boomed at 2 p.m. that waziri wa fedha amejiuzulu. But when Edwin went back to the car, he opened the letter, discovered that the letter was a letter firing him as a Minister of Finance. So he resigned and he got fired, more or less at the same time. No, those stories also can tell us a lot, both for people who think we should have stayed longer or continuing with command and control, and those who thought that we could have done slightly different. And we were discussing with the Vice Chancellor here about Professor Justinian Remam, one of the finest economics mind in Africa, not in Tanzania, who was an assistant to Mwalimu Nyerere on economic affairs, and also they parted ways. And then he went and worked at the UN, assisting the Secretary General of the UN on economics. He died at the tender age, I think, of 40 by that time. Those areas need to be critically thought, and we should try to put together a story that will also share with our youth and equip them to see how they can understand our history. How can we explain to people that after the war against Idi Amin, our economy virtually collapsed? 1980. What really went wrong? Was it just the war? Was it a war and mismanagement? Or was there a sabotage? Because by that time, there was this kind of Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in UK, those kind of things. And we need to critically think what was going on in our country at that time. So, in my view, development studies remain critical. This is an aspect which I think we need to do. We need to also try to see how we can discuss issues of meritocracy and fairness. And I think there is a tension. And you look at the economic history of Tanzania, it's a tension between meritocracy and fairness. When you just pursue meritocracy, you may lose some.